and on Zoom. So.
Okay, so welcome everyone to the first event in the visit of Dr. John Borrows, the virtual visit to the University of Alberta. This visit is sponsored by the Distinguished Visitors Fund, which is located in the office of the Vice President of Research and Innovation at the University of Alberta. We have technical support today from the Arts Resource Center in the Faculty of Arts in the form of Claire Peters and Grant Wang. And I'd like to thank Annette and Diane Johnson in the Department of English for their help in publicizing and doing finances. I'll begin with the Territorial Acknowledgement, and then I'm actually going to use the Territorial Acknowledgement to introduce John and his work. The University of Alberta acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory and respects the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. That's actually the University of Alberta's mandated statement, which interestingly appears on the university webpage under University Relations, Brand and Communications. So I'm going to start by asking why read this acknowledgement rather than others, because if you know me, then you know I read everything all the time. I was struck in reviewing this statement because it actually shows the impact of John's work, especially that last clause which I raised and tried to emphasize with my voice. To repeat, the university statement acknowledges First Peoples whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. I think in the context of a statement on treaties, territory, and title, the affirmation of the living presence of Indigenous people is a response to John's well-known criticism of roughly 20 years ago of the assumption in Canadian law and culture, settler Canadian law and culture, that Indigenous rights are frozen rights, and his satire of the assumptions underlying this prejudice, which, as he argued 20 years ago, relegated Indigenous development to the distant past. I really think it was John who made institutions careful about the way they speak and about the way they speak about history and time. So in acknowledging the continuing presence of Indigenous people, we're also, I think, acknowledging the continuing impact of John's work and his influence on us. So I'll proceed now to a bio of John, and then I'll say a few words about why this visit, which I've been planning really since last September, I guess. John Borrows is Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Law at the University of Victoria. He's also held positions at a number of other universities, so this information might interest you, such as the University of Minnesota, the University of Toronto, the University of British Columbia, and Osgoode Hall Law School at York University. John's many influential publications include Recovering Canada, The Resurgence of Indigenous Law, which is kind of a good starting place, I think, and has influenced my intro today. It won the Donald Smiley Award for Best Book in Canadian Political Science in 2002. Other titles include Canada's Indigenous Constitution, also won an award in 2011, Drawing Out Law, The Spirit's Guide in 2010, Freedom and Indigenous Constitutionalism, which won the Smiley Award again in 2016. And Law's Indigenous Ethics, which was acknowledged as Best Subsequent Book by NASA in 2020. He's also co-edited several volumes and published many, many papers. Among other honors, John was the 2017 Killam Prize winner in Social Sciences and the 2019 Molson Prize winner from the Canada Council for the Arts. He was the 2020 winner of the Governor General's Innovation Award. John is a member of the Chippewas of the Nawash First Nation, which is located in Georgian Bay, which, as you all know, is in Lake Huron in northwesternish Ontario, as we now call it. So why this visit? That's John's bio. If you want more information on him, more is available. A good source is his own website at the University of Victoria. Why this visit, and why invite John to speak to us from the Department of Literature, right? Why did this invitation come from an English department? We'll go back 20 years to when John argued that Canadian law is, in fact, an amalgam of different legal orders. And he affirmed the principles of law can, in fact, coexist without conflict, which was a way of affirming the similarities between legal orders. Indigenous rights arise from traditional laws and practices, he argues, and he adds that sources of Indigenous legal principles include stories, narrative, literature. Stories express law and are central to normative legal structures. One strength of this approach, he has argued, is the reinterpretation of tradition to meet contemporary needs and contexts. The danger of freezing oral tradition, I already mentioned in commenting on the acknowledgement. John affirms that Indigenous people review historical experiences and cultural epics to formulate and apply their own law. So this for me is the great connection and the great opportunity in this visit, this relationship between what we call law and what we call literature. John has affirmed that Indigenous legal principles can be accepted by analogy into Canadian law because cross-fertilization is already built into the common law. So he looks for areas of commonality. He stresses the difficulty of acquiring knowledge in this area though, or at least he did 20 years ago, which, as he wrote in 22, tends to become a personal quest. He affirmed then that the acquisition of knowledge in law is neither magical nor mystical, but requires years of study and hard work. When he wrote this, I think at the time he seemed to be sending a strong signal to schools and universities, and law schools in particular, about perhaps the way education needed to be reformed. John also affirms that settings for the implementation of law extend beyond formal institutions of Canadian law to less formal settings, such as the family, inter-family relationships, and the community generally. One of the issues that John raises in his work is how legal systems might have to change or transform themselves to accommodate each other. And indeed, he affirms that the common law might have to be reframed. And intriguingly for me, anyway, and I think for us, I hope, the common law might have to include a different approach towards the literary, the poetic, and narrative. And my question, and the question I guess guiding the visit, one question anyway, is are we ready for that? Are we in settler Canada ready for this transformation? Often members of settler society refer to Indigenous rights claims as somehow irrational or a nuisance, rather than an opportunity for self-transformation. And my other question is, are we ready after so many decades of devaluing literary study, which is really coming to a crescendo right now? Are we ready institutionally? And are we ready in our educational backgrounds, in our educational disciplinary formations? One thing that will be necessary, John argues, is the overcoming of a non-Aboriginal characterization of Aboriginality, as he put it in Recovering Canada. A non-Aboriginal characterization of Aboriginality evidence, law, and literature. One he detected in the Supreme Court of Canada's decisions on rights in the 1990s. Back then, the Supreme Court set out a discourse of conformity to Western standards rather than a project for mutual translation and transformation. This would mean overcoming the topos of frozen development, which I mentioned already, which relegates Indigenous development to the distant past, foreclosing growth and change. Reconciliation for John requires concessions and transformation on both sides. A more promising basis, he argued, would be the recognition of ancestral laws and customs and their development and through the interaction with the federal crown. Just to wrap up this introduction, I'll briefly outline my interest here. so that you know where I'm at. It seems to me one of the standards that will have to come under challenge if we agree that reconciliation requires mutual transformation will be the concept of the literary, or what I prefer to call the poetic. As I've argued for years, the poetic in what we vaguely call the Western European tradition or Western European metaphysics or Platonism is already a racialized concept, and it's already defined within a racialized hierarchy. At the very moment that John is affirming stories as sources of law, we're living within the devaluation of the poetic and of narrative, and reorganizing institutions of learning, such as this one, around classical anti-poetic prejudices, which are simultaneously racial prejudices in disguise. So that is my introduction of John and my own mission statement for this visit. Now I'm going to turn you over to John, and I think he will do everything differently.
Miigwech, Bujun, the Dinue Kanidok, Aniji Nishnabek, Nichmarazek, Bangi Etigo Ninata Nishnabem, and Gagujitu and Jistamayan, Giganos, Nindijnakas, Neashi, Winigiming and Donjaba, Nigindodem. Introducing myself and my thanks for this invitation, Miigwech Biajaeg, Nungum, and look forward to an opportunity to talk with and visit with and interact with you, Christopher, and others as we're here together over this week. This is a series of visits that I'll be engaging with, and this is just introductions today, as you've outlined. And I really like your question about the moment of readiness, and I think that we're going to have some good discussion about that as we're with one another through our time together. And so I hope we keep coming back to that, and you asked me pointedly and tangentially whether or not we are ready for Indigenous law and story and standards and ways as a part of our relationality that is mutually transformative in a positive way, as opposed to what we've been living through, which is marginalizing and impoverished in many different registers. But I do want to introduce myself further before we maybe have a little bit more of a conversation here. And I'm going to share some slides here just for that purpose. So let me go back to the beginning here. So this is where I'm from in terms of my family. It's the Cape Croker Indian Reserve. It's in Ontario, as Christopher mentioned, on the shores of Georgian Bay. This is what it looks like this year, and I wish I could be there. This is the first time I've not been home to the reserve in over a year because of the pandemic, and I'm missing home quite strongly. My sister and mother live there. My father passed away about a year before the pandemic, and so a longing is in my heart for this beautiful space. But I'm grateful I'm safe, and I'm grateful my sister and mother have received their vaccines. My mother had a stroke over the past few months, and it's been hard not to be with them because of that as well. But there's great beauty, and she lost her speech and has recovered her speech. And I look forward to getting together with her. I'm speaking to you from Wasanich territory, which is what's now called Victoria. The Sanchothan speaking people live here, of the Sartlip and Sekam and Pakwachin and Sekam reserves. And it's wonderful to be in this area, learning with people, Sayot reserves, I mean. It's wonderful to be in this area. The Douglas treaties are here. I live and learn and work amongst these people, and I learn a lot about law from them, including stories about their first ancestors, which is rain. And you can imagine being on the West Coast, how significant that is in relationship to their origins. There's also the Lekwungen speaking peoples that are here, and the Songhees and Esquimalt nations are also good hosts, and Dr. Skip Dick often takes that role of acknowledgement that Christopher did at the beginning of our time together, and it's so gracious of him to be able to express the need for gratitude and welcome. And so I want to express my appreciation for being here on this territory. Nigigin Dodem, I'm from the Otter clan. And so here's my family. Here's who I'm related to. Our creation story places us in relationship to the animals. And I don't have time to talk about it right now, but maybe I will somewhere along the way. But when the first giant otter passed, the otter people arose from his carcass, just as when the giant bear or beaver or caribou passed, the clans came from that ancestor. And so this is my relation, Nigig in Dodem. Ododeman, Ode is our word for heart. Dodem or totem, as it's often called, is where we attach our heart, where we find our heart. It's related to this family, this kinship that we are in a literal and metaphorical relationship with. Neashi Wadingaming and Donjaba. I'm from the Cape Croker Indian Reserve, or Neashi Wadingaming, and there's the arrow pointing to it. It's about 3 hours north of Toronto on the Saugeen or the Bruce Peninsula, and about 4 hours north of Detroit. And you can see it's there in the Eastern Great Lakes. And the language that I introduced myself in is Ojibwe or Chippewa, Anishinaabemowin. It's a part of a large Algonquian language family that is down in the United States with Passamaquoddy and Abenaki, and then into Canada, where there's also Passamaquoddy, Abenaki, Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqiyik, Innu, Cree, Potawatomi, Odawa, cross into the Plains Cree out to the Blackfoot people at the foot of the Rocky Mountains there in southern Alberta. It's a broad language family. There's a couple of other Algonquian groups. The Cheyenne of the mid-plains in the United States are Algonquian, and there's 2 Algonquian-speaking groups in Northern California. So it's an east-west language family, and that's where I'm from. Here's the territory more in focus, and you can see my reserve there is at this place. There's another reserve that's our sister reserve across the way called the Saugeen First Nation, and you can see we're surrounded by the waters of Georgian Bay and Lake Huron. And this is our treaty territory. In 1836, a treaty was made from Goderich to Arthur, north there to Collingwood. That's my traditional territory. And it's a beautiful area of limestone escarpments that rise out of the waters. As you know, Niagara Falls cuts through the backbone of Ontario before disappearing here under Lake Huron, and then rising again in Manitoulin, going across Manitoulin, and then actually down into Wisconsin, Green Bay, Wisconsin, where it seems to terminate. So that's my clan, and this is my territory, and this is my family. This is my 3rd great uncle. His name is Tecumseh, Tecumseh. Oseh is the word for walk. Tecum is actually to walk across. And he did that in his life as he walked across the eastern part of the continent from what is now Ontario down into Florida, trying to bring First Nations into alliance with one another to resist the challenge of the rising United States of America, and created a relationship of peace and friendship and respect with the British, and became allied along with the British against the United States of America, and fought and lost his life eventually in the War of 1812. He, like I said, is my great uncle, but it's through marriage. He married a woman named Wasega Boa, and Wasega Boa is my 3rd great grandfather's sister, and his name is Giganos, and Giganos is the name that I carry. So when I introduced myself, I said Giganos Nindigenakas, Neashi Wadigaming in Dodonjaba, Nigigan Dodem. So I let you know my clan, where I'm from, and what my name is. And his name, Giganos, that 3rd great grandfather, Giga do is our word to speak in Anishinaabemowin, and ons is the diminutive of. So he was the little speaker, or in other words, he was a speaker that was charged with remembering what took place in council and then pulling the remembrance of that into other councils. And so that was the role that he had within the community. And that's the role that my mother passed along to me as a part of my growing up. And I'm sharing this now for another reason, which is this is related to the first piece of research that I ever did, which was my LLM or my master's research, which was called A Genealogy of Law, that looked at 7 generations of my family history, the challenges that we received in relationship to the Canadian state, or the British or the American state, and then what we did to be resilient in the face of that. So here's the next generation. This is Peter Giganos-Jones there on the right. And then on the left are the works of my great-great-grandmother, Margaret MacLeod. So let me explain about them. Here on the right, or sorry, on the right, is that right? The left, actually, Peter Giganos-Jones is wearing medals around his neck. He entered into a treaty dealing with 1.5 million acres of land in Ontario and putting his otter signature, DOTEM, on that treaty, welcoming people to come and live in accordance with our laws. And he received a medal from Queen Victoria for doing that. Another medal is around his neck because he rescued a surveyor out of the bush who was in great distress and likely to perish around Markdale, Ontario. And then he received the recognition for doing that. He also fought in the Mackenzie Rebellion in 1837 in Ontario, and he was a chief of our community. On the other side of the page there, Tales of Nokomis. These are stories from my second great-grandmother, Margaret MacLeod, and they're told to her ancestor, Verna Patronella Johnson. And when Verna wrote the preface to this book, she said that she heard these stories from my great-great-grandmother, and that my great-great-grandmother said that they came from her great-great-great grandparents. So in other words, the stories that are recorded here go at least 5-6 generations back, and they're stories about how we should live with one another. They are our stories of law, as Christopher was talking about. And so the tradition of treaties was passed down to me through this great-great-grandfather, and this tradition of stories was passed down to me through this great-great-grandmother. Now she, Margaret MacLeod, was actually born to a mother whose name was Teresa Riel, and her father was Joseph MacLeod. And so you've got Peter here being dressed as a Métis person because she comes from a MacLeod, a Riel line, but she married into the Chippewa of the Nawash, or our folks at Neashiwinigaming, and so therefore you've got this interesting blending of worlds between Métis and Anishinaabe that continues to be Anishinaabe, but has this wonderful work that comes in through that mingling and mixing. This is my great grandfather. His name is Charles Giganos-Jones. He was a hereditary leader in our community, serving on council as both chief and councillor for over 50 years. He was the most significant figure in my young mother's life. He was a very loving person, and he was a very strong person too. When he was 100 years old, he walked in from the bush carrying a deer around his neck. You can imagine how heavy a deer is and how much strength you would have to have at 100 to be able to do that. Beautiful, honorable person. Here's some of their relations that they married, and you can see their pictures there in different eras. This is the grandfather that I have, Josh Jones, sitting outside the old family cabin at Cape Croker with my sister beside him. Josh was a character. He was a rum runner during the Prohibition era, and ferried liquor back and forth between Detroit and Windsor in that time. Indians couldn't drink at that time under the Indian Act. And so this was a real effort that he took to do this. He also, received an honorary doctorate from the University of Kentucky because of his knowledge of plants, because that, my great-great-grandmother not only was a storyteller, she was a medicine woman, and we have her medicine tradition passed along. And so he knew about those plants. Likewise, he was a Hollywood Indian. He went to Hollywood in the 1930s and participated in that silent film era. And he was a part of a union called the First Americans, which were all Indigenous peoples that would speak their language with one another, and they would organize in relationship to what was happening in Hollywood at that time. But when they bombed Pearl Harbor, he packed up his family, Grapes of Wrath style, and made his way back to Ontario. My mother was born in California, but she came to the reserve at age 4 and has spent a lot of her life and last 30 years of her life on the reserve there. And here she is, my mother, a powerful, amazing woman with great knowledge of stories again, and an attentiveness to the natural world. And I feel like those ancestors that I've been showing you were able to pass on to me some of that information because of her knowledge and her abilities. And there, of course, I am in her arms as a young boy coming into the world, fresh-faced and appreciative of that connection. Now here's my daughter, Gigata, Lindsay. She's got her jingle dress on there with this beautiful Brett, and she's amazing storyteller herself. She published a book about Indigenous law and language revitalization called Otter's Journeys. And there's a lot of stories that are found in her book that are connected to the stories that I've been telling you. And then I have another daughter here. Her name is Chikchikchigadase, which is the word for chickadee. And she is a fantastic young woman. And then now I've got a son-in-law here, Sean Ritchie. And then I've now got a granddaughter who's almost 2 years old. Her name is Wasea, which means shining, bright, and clear. And that's a family name as well that comes from my second great grandmother, who was also a medicine woman and also a storyteller. And so it's great to be able to see these things work their way through the generation. I just want to pause just before I finish here and make note that this was my first publication, A Genealogy of Law, Inherent Sovereignty and First Nations Self-Government, again, stemming from my master's thesis, and published in the Osgoode Hall Law Journal in 1992. And you can see just by this table of contents that what I tried to do was go through these generations and look at the different challenges we faced through the generations and say how we preserved our autonomy, our agency, our ability to access our own laws, governance, and legal traditions. So from things like war and religion, through healthcare and language and education, through being away from Nawash, then going back to Nawash, entering into treaties, and then the self-governance issues as a result of the Indian Act and the great pressure that that Indian Act placed on us, but nevertheless did not destroy the ability that we have to look to our own normativity to try to create a path forward. And I think what I hope to do in this time we have together over this week is develop some of the things that I've learned from those early days that connect back to that beautiful land, to my clan, to those stories, to that experience that I have and my ancestors have, to talk about things like freedom and Indigenous Constitutionalism, which is the symposium that will be taking place tomorrow at the same time. And really talking about one of my books as a result of that, which is here, this Freedom and Indigenous Constitutionalism book that was published in 2016. And then the next day on Wednesday, talk about law, story, and dream, Indigenous legal traditions, and narrative focus. And I published a book in 2010 that Christopher mentioned called Drawing Out Law, a Spirit's Guide, that is written in a story format. It's not a linear structure. And at the beginning of each chapter, there's a scroll that's there, which is our way of engaging with literacy. But perhaps there's some of the poetics in this as well that Christopher was talking about, because they're related to dreams, many of these stories that are told within this book. And then we'll talk about Louise Erdrich's Roundhouse on the 11th, and that will be a seminar with the graduate students. And I really look forward to having that conversation. When Louise was writing this book, I was teaching at the University of Minnesota, and she shared a draft copy of the book with me. I was able to read it in that form, and I don't want to claim anything for myself, but the interaction there certainly informed me. And I think she was informed by something I passed along to her, which is from one of your colleagues' LLM thesis, Hadley Friedland, about Weendigos. And so the Weendigo theme that Hadley developed in her LLM, I think came a little bit more strongly through in this book as a result of me being able to learn so much, of course, from Louise. She's the brilliant genius, but just giving her a source or two about some of the interesting work that was happening around us. So look forward to that conversation. And then we have a Town and Gown event. This is on Thursday, again, the 11th. We'll be talking about laws, Indigenous ethics, and that is that recent book that Christopher was talking about. And I look forward to having a conversation around that. And then finally, on the Friday, talking about writing from an Indigenous, writing as an Indigenous practice. And you can see behind me some of this as I've worked with artists in relationship to some of the books that I've published. And you can see other forms of expression that are poetics, are writing that might not necessarily always find their way to this kind of a register, but nevertheless are about people reflecting and passing along their dreams, their hopes, their aspirations, their research, their observations. And so that's a bit of an introduction to myself in about 20 minutes or so, maybe just to set the stage for what we're doing. And I'm grateful for this invitation. I'm grateful to be able to speak at the University of Alberta. My daughter is currently doing her LLM at the University of Alberta in the law school. And so I felt extra appreciation that I would receive this invitation, and look forward to the time that we'll have together.
Thanks for that wonderful introduction, and especially the audio visuals. I suppose I would open discussion to the floor. There is no floor, to the virtual floor. I would invite people to pose any questions they might have at this point. Part of the purpose of this meeting is simply, when we were discussing this meeting back in the fall, or this visit really, I kind of thought I had no idea what was going to happen or how a virtual visit would work, so that we needed some kind of brief introductory session to get people oriented and to explain how the events would work. I do have to announce that my original idea was that there would be a pre-recorded element to all of this. There would be pre-recorded lectures. Well, to quote Eden Robinson, "Ha bloody ha." It didn't work out. We weren't very happy with the results, and in retrospect, I don't know what I was thinking. I thought somehow it would increase participation because I have the ever-present Zoom fatigue on my mind when I'm planning. So no, contrary to all previous advertising, there will be no pre-recordings. All of these will be live events, which I now think will be much better. Finally, there will be online office hours. These will be from 1 to 1:50 on Wednesday and Friday, the 10th and the 12th. If you want to join, then I would suggest emailing me, and I'm about to post my email address. Email me and I'll send you a link if you want to join John during office hours at these times. That's 1 to 1:50 on Wednesday and Friday afternoons. Now, if anyone has questions or comments.
As you're thinking about a question, I can anticipate one perhaps, which is, how did I do this research that I've just described to you? Well, I went home and talked to my great aunt and great uncle and sat at their kitchen table for many hours, hearing from them the story of that genealogy that went through time, and getting lots of specifics in that regard. And my aunt and my mother came along with me. And so there was often 4 or 5 of us that would be gathered around a kitchen table having this discussion, so that they would prompt one another and recognize that the conversations can't just be unidirectional. And then after we did this with all of these visits, then I went to the archive and pieced through the archive to see whether or not I could find a connection to what they were talking about. And I was really grateful for their orientation, because it was like a puzzle piece that I found in the archive. And I wouldn't have known what to do with that piece of the puzzle had I not had a picture that had been painted for me by my great aunt and great uncle Fred and Irene. And so then when a little piece would emerge in the archive, I could sort of figure out where that might fit, or if there was something that was suspicious about the archive because of the way it had been recorded. And another piece is my mother would take me out on the land, and she would describe to me many of the places that these events were taking place, including, I can remember standing on the shores of the Saugeen River right near Lake Huron. And she said, "I want you to hug this tree." And I said, "What?" I was like a 25-year-old man. She says, "No, I want you to appreciate this tree." It was an old maple tree. And she said, "I want you to do this because, it will have seen generations of our ancestors come and go." And so, I kind of reluctantly embraced the tree, a little embarrassed, but, being a good boy and wanting to listen to my mother. And so I did. And then when I was in the archives later on, I discovered that place where that tree was called Chief's Point, after my third great grandfather, because that's where he brought people out during the War of 1812 up the coast beyond Guardrich towards the Southampton area to keep the young people and those who were vulnerable away from the theater of war. And so what she did there was actually cement in my mind the importance of that place, so that when I was looking, I think I became more receptive to what was happening as a result. And so it was oral history research, lots of stories, and then with those stories going out into other places and trying to figure out how I might correlate these two things together.
Okay, we have a question on chat from April Gladu. Can you please comment on the challenges and opportunities in bringing your knowledge? Whoops, I just lost it. My computer just put something in front of my face, so I can't read the message. Okay, there it's gone. Thank you, computer. Can you please comment on the challenges and opportunities in bringing your rich knowledge and stories into mainstream academic and legal? This is from Yasmin Abu Laban. There's another question before that, was there?
I'll answer that question first, perhaps. So the challenge and opportunities are many, as Christopher identified. Is the world ready for stories from Indigenous peoples to form law? And in fact, my first 3 or 4 months of being in the master's program, I had a vision of what a law thesis would look like. And you can imagine it was a pretty conventional imaginary. that viewed that I had to cite lots of cases and lots of legislation, and then analyze the relationship between the cases and the legislation. And I recognized after starting to talk to my great aunt and great uncle that I was self-censoring, that I was only seeing law through a Western lens of statutes and cases. And what they were teaching me was that law comes from people's interactions, functionally setting standards and principles and criteria and measures and signposts and guidance by the lessons that are found in the language and found in the story. And so when I made that breakthrough, the thesis came pretty quickly after that. But the biggest challenge was my own lack of imagination, my own self-censorship, that a thesis had to look like a certain thing. And so that was one piece. And then, of course, when I went to publish it more generally and put it out in the world, I still had to explain what I was doing as law, because most of my colleagues would think of law as more institutionally generated by courts or legislatures. But having said that, there was another opportunity, which is in 1992, 1990, the court for the first time passed an Aboriginal rights case, or made an Aboriginal rights case. And I was writing in 1990, 1991. And they said that just because a right was regulated in great detail didn't mean it was extinguished. So just because there was lots of writing from legislatures and the executive over top of Aboriginal rights didn't mean the thing underneath it was extinguished. And I thought, there's an opportunity. I can talk about how underneath what we're doing all along is our own stuff, and people are trying to overwrite it, but it's not extinguishment. And so that opened up a space of opportunity for me to understand that the courts might have some space there for recognizing that the source of law isn't the legislature, isn't the courts itself, but it's those pre-existing Indigenous relationalities and poetics, as Christopher talked about, that survived the assertion of Crown sovereignty. And though they've been put upon, as my thesis explained, they were never extinguished. We were resilient in the face of those things. We were active agents, not just passive victims. And so that is, I think, that challenge there that I faced, self-censorship, and would anyone recognize that? But then there was also an opportunity created because the courts said, well, in fact, Indigenous law isn't created by Canada, it's created by Indigenous peoples themselves. So that was the opening I needed to start prying things open a little bit wider in the subsequent work I was doing.
Thanks. So, okay, I can finally read my computer now. I've been doing this for a year. I still can't do it. There's a question about resistance. I think this was the first question that came up on chat. Can you talk about resistance in the form of poetry, literature, legal writing, and whether you think resistance is needed more than ever now, or also how best to do that resistance?
I do love that question, because the favorite stories that I received when I was doing my research were trickster stories, Nana Bojo. And if you know anything about the trickster, he's simultaneously harmful and helpful, kind and cunning, charming, and plays mean tricks. And so within that tradition is understanding of resistance and contrast and complexity and the danger of a single story and the need for nuance as you try to put various things together. And they're not always possible to be reconciled, that you have to just be prepared to hold things in two hands and say, well, why did he do this? And what happened over here? And you're left with that contrast that provides a space for engagement and also a space for resistance, not doing things the same way that they were done before. And so I learn a lot about resistance from our trickster characters and from those that told me about the trickster because of the way they lived their lives, trying to occupy that space that wasn't filling other people's expectation as they would always hope, but they were doing something a bit new, a bit different because of the way they combined the forces that would come together through that engagement. So yeah, that is so powerful, but it also means that there's spaces for engagement as well as not just talking about resistance. They can be simultaneously present. It's not an either or possibility, it's like and the trickster is sometimes very engaging and does things that are quite helpful and quite welcome by the community, and of course the trickster is a transformer too, right? Not just transforms from a frog to a rock to a person to a buffalo, but then also transforms the setting, the scene, the characters, the plot. Twists and turns take place there in those set of stories. And of course, there's a huge law and politics within that for Anishinaabe and other Indigenous peoples who think about those stories and how they can mean that we just don't have to take one approach to the work that we do. We can maybe ourselves occupy that space of the trickster, even though as we do that, we're as likely to get burned ourselves because we can't just think that we're going to be free of the unintended consequences, the things that we don't foresee, where sometimes we think we're putting something out there in the world that's good, and in fact, it can be quite harmful or compromising. And so that is another lesson that I take from trying to work with resistance.
Okay, thank you for that answer. Another question on John. This question came up while you were saying something. With mother who shows plants and shares stories. In the process, how much can and do our personal relationality to the land and stories we hear or tell inform the ways we navigate the academy and the courts? Is there a room for the personal story in these heavy institutions?
Yeah, you know, sometimes in Western parlance, we think about law as being something that's done to you, that's an external force. And it's not just that simple, but that's how we might think about it. And usually we teach that form in law schools, that you're applying yourself to something that's out there, that you're constantly working against or critiquing or analogizing, as the case might be. But for at least a big part of the Anishinaabe legal tradition, is it something that you're meant to carry around inside you and see it as a part of yourself. And so the question here about someone's mother taking them and showing them the plants and sharing the stories as they hiked around Cold Lake and Espanola, that's very familiar to me because what I think is happening there is you're participating in the interpretation of law, what these plants mean, as you take action in relationship to them, the work of law in that site. And so the personal and the relationality is a big part of learning Anishinaabe law. And so we'll talk about this in a later lecture, maybe the Laws of Indigenous Ethics lecture on Thursday evening. We do a lot of land-based education where we take law students out to like my reserve, and we have them hear stories by walking along the path and pointing to the plants and eating the berries and participating with elders and trying to find that connection. Now, what does that do with the how does that relate to the academy? I think I've just given a possible answer there. The academy shouldn't just be about our walls and our offices and our classrooms, but we should engage with the wider world. And then how does that engage with the courts? Was trying to help the courts to see that they aren't the only authorities, right? It's not to take away from the respect that could be due there, but it's just to recognize that it doesn't take anything away from them to show that there's other sites of interpretation that are normative, that are obligatory, that pass along what we call law. And so I love the question, because I think that's what we're trying to do here at the University of Victoria. We have a joint degree in Indigenous law and the common law, first of its kind in the world. It's now in its third year of operation, is trying to have the students work transsystemically, learn from the academy, learn from the courts, but then also learn more relationally from field schools. I take the students outside quite frequently when we're not in COVID, and I will use my drum, or I'll talk in the language. I'm not fluent, but I'll talk enough to be able to share some messages there, or share a story or something like that. So it's a good point, and it's one of the themes that will be engaged over this week as I am in this virtual visit with everyone here. Did I see that Rob had raised his hand? If you could speak.
Hi. Yeah, I decided to raise my hand in the spirit of some reciprocity and to turn my camera on. So thanks for kind of being here with us. My question is maybe a bit daft, but is a larger thematic question. And as I'm looking forward to your visit, I'm wondering if you might speak to sort of three large kind of terms that have come up, and just a little bit of a primer on how you see the relationship between them, those being ethics, poetics, and law, as three intertwined, but maybe from my perspective, also divergent ways of thinking about social relations.
That's a great question. And let me just take a first cut at this now, and then I'll keep reflecting on your question as we go through our visits together. But my first reflection is that Anishinaabemowin is an 80% verb-based language. Algonquian languages are 80% verb-based. And so when you're in the world of verbs, you're into conjugations. And so there's not the same kind of insistence on the categorizations that nouns might hold. And so, the distinction between poetics and law and ethics, if you're talking as nouns, can be quite significant. But if you start to put things into a verb-based possibilities, you can suddenly inflect it in many different ways by mashing words together, like prefixes and suffixes, tenses, reciprocality. There's just so many possibilities that are present there. So it's not that I'm trying to duck the distinctions between poetics and law and ethics. There definitely need to make distinctions between different modes, different ways. But I also guess I'm saying is, let's not be too precise if we're going to be working in a verb-based, at least, frame, so that we might be able to think about what are the relationship between those things as well. And so maybe that's just my initial answer. I want to be able to think about their distinctions, and I'll work with that with you. But I also want to be able to think about their relationships, and maybe we'll go back and forth between nouns and verbs here along the way. That's an amazing question, and it's actually, I just feel goosebumps around it, because I can think about what we might do over this week together to further get to that point.
Thank you. And the introduction to conjugation as a way of thinking through different grammars of relation is right off the bat very exciting to me too. So thanks.
Wonderful. Thanks, Rob. Johanna Bird.
Hi, sorry, I just had to switch my camera. Chimigwech for your introduction. It was so lovely. And yeah, so many things about it that I find so compelling, the relationship between law and land and story. My question just has to do with, so in the history of, I guess we could talk about like attempts to include Indigenous peoples in Canadian law. You know, in your efforts to think with your Anishinaabe legal traditions, how did you deal with, you know, just I'm thinking of stereotypes or kind of racist ideas that you must have come up against in trying to make your own case for why the work that you were doing was important. I'd just be interested to hear about what your journey was like in that regard.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's probably a lot of different dimensions to that. But one comes to mind, is I try to put the shoe on the other foot sometimes. And as Christopher talked about, irony and sarcasm might be a possibility just to get people to suddenly inhabit that space where they are stereotyped or they do find themselves a bit adrift because it's not their way of maybe naturally proceeding. And so I'm just thinking of an instance when I was doing some work with the Canadian, the Institute for the Administration of Canadian Justice or something like that. There was like 500 judges. And Maria Campbell and myself and Joseph Naitahau and maybe about 20 other Indigenous lawyers and judges said, we need to help introduce Indigenous law to these judges. And so we were in the Hotel Bessborough in the big dining hall there. And what we told was the first fart story. And these judges were like, what is going on here? You could tell that they had no idea what was being presented as Joseph was playing his flute and acting like Nana Bojo, and Maria Campbell was narrating this incredible story. They're thinking, what are we just being made fun of here as judges? Of course, there was a bit of fun that was being made there, but we had a discussion afterwards. And it was interesting, all the Indigenous peoples, not all, but many Indigenous peoples that had been invited that weren't part of the planning group, they totally got where law was. And they were all just like, oh. And the judges just didn't have a thing to say about that. And they could start to see, as Indigenous peoples interpreted for them, where the law was in that first fart story. But it put the shoe on the other foot. And they suddenly recognized that there was something that was shared, because people were talking from Quebec to Alberta, having a relationship to that story. And they might have been Cree or Ojibwe or Blackfoot, but there was something of a similarity there. Not that there's a pan-indigeneity, but a methodology was being shared. And it was exciting. And so sometimes dealing with stereotypes and misunderstandings, that putting the shoe on the other foot, having a little bit of fun, laughing, even teasing, right? We were teasing, obviously, but there was a seriousness underneath that, because then they saw, oh, we might not always be experts in what we're called upon to do here in passing law in relationship to this Indigenous community, because there's other obligations that are going on that, so there's a bit of humility, I think, that started to set in as a result. So thanks for that question, to give me an opportunity to share that story.
Thank you. It makes me think too of Dr. Bracken's comment at the beginning about anti-poetic prejudice as racial prejudice. And I think those are connected somehow. Thank you.
I think you're muted there, Christopher.
Pardon me. Oh yeah, that's the first time I've done that. No, thanks for these great questions, and the discussion is already fascinating. We originally planned this first meeting as 1 hour, I think, as an introductory meeting. We don't want to wear out our visitor on the first day. And there's lots to come. Does anyone else have a question or comment? I think one last question or comment. Otherwise, I think we'll wrap for the day and look forward to tomorrow's symposium. So tomorrow's symposium will feature Joshua Nichols and Darcy Lindberg from the Faculty of Law, who are also, I believe, along with Hadley Friedland, your students formerly, John.
That's right.
That's correct. And I think we've agreed on a kind of conversational, informal format for that event, which I'm looking forward to very much. So I think people are signing off and giving their thanks, a lot of thanks. So I think we'll wrap this event for today and thank John. You can applaud virtually if you want. If you like emojis, there's a few available on Zoom. Yeah, there we go.
Thank you, everyone.
Much.
It's so good to be with you. I'm looking forward to our time together and hope you have a great evening.
Yeah, thanks again.
Take
We'll see you
care.
tomorrow.
Gigawabaman.
Thanks. Bye.